super-powered family dysfunction, weird as all get out, and maybe some dancing too. Netflix original series, The Umbrella Academy, Season 1, review and breakdown, filled with spoilers. Hey y'all, it's your Twisted Girl Next Door here, and this video is basically me breaking down, talking about all the happenings when it comes to the Netflix original series, The Umbrella Academy, because, oh my gosh, so much happened. Oh yes. And if you don't want spoilers, and more so you haven't watched this season yet, and you might just kind of want to feel for how it is, and if you should watch it, and some recommendations and things to look out for, I already have a video that is spoiler-free review, where I just kind of touch upon my regular pros and cons without getting super or any spoilery at all. So I'll put a link to that in the description for this video. Okay, so the way I think I'm going to do this is I want to talk about my overall feelings about what happened this season with spoilers, the happenings as in what happened this season, and ship talk because, oh my gosh, we have to talk about ships and relationships pretty much when it comes to this show, because this show is pretty much relationships galore when it comes to all of the characters. Predictions, even though I am stumped as to where things are going, but I want to make predictions anyway. And of course, because this is based off a graphic novel series, I want to talk about the comparisons. So overall, this was such an intense and weird show. I really enjoyed that this show stood in its truth of weirdness. Like, it wasn't the paint by the numbers kind of, it wants to be edgy, so it does edgy stuff here and there, but it's really kind of just doing paint by the numbers edgy, as in the same kind of edgy that we've seen in other so-called edgy shows. This show was like, yeah, we're weird. We're so weird. You kind of had to, I feel like you had to go into this show without wanting to judge, kind of without being like, this character is sucky, this character is good, this character is bad, this relationship is great, this relationship is wrong. You couldn't really watch this show, I feel like, and enjoy it if you went in there with such a closed off mind of what the possibilities of plot lines were. Because if you went into this show saying you can and cannot do that, then you shouldn't really be watching the show, because this show was basically to that question or to that statement would say, no, we can do whatever we want. And it did. Okay, so the big bad apocalypse we found out was because of Vanya, right? Like, Vanya was the culprit, which, let's be honest, I feel like they kind of foreshadowed that. Like, she was too, like, meek and gentle, and to the point where it's like, oh, there's nothing special about me, but there's totally something special about you, and deadly, girl. And so, yeah, it was Vanya, at least in this kind of plot line, timeline that was going on. We also found out that Leonard, her love, or her manipulative love, was evil, but more so he was like a basic guy. And so it's kind of interesting they subverted that trope in the sense of she wasn't like meek and gentle and like he was the super villain to the point where he had a lot of powers, but more so like he had no powers and he was trying to use her stuff because of his man pain of feeling rejected. Although he did go through some real serious trauma when he was younger, but nonetheless, you know, he was going through some stuff and he manipulated her because he got a hold of their adoptive father's book that pretty much was a journal of everything about all of them. We find out that Claw's powers are growing. Like, for a good amount of this season, he had pretty much been avoiding his powers, right? Because of the trauma that he dealt with from his adopted dad, and just not wanting to face and being afraid of ghosts and things of that nature, which is ironic because he can channel them. And we saw this exploration with his sibling Ben of the connection they had throughout the season and how that eventually made it so that Claus kind of got to see that he has a new power, and that Ben was finally acknowledged by the rest of his siblings of actually being there. Also in the midst of this, Alison is really the MVP. Let's just, like, with everything that happened, Alison was pretty much the MVP. I mean, she was really trying to connect with Vanya, and, you know, that cost her, in a way, her powers because of what Vanya did. But also, even at the end, where she had the choice, she could have killed Vanya, right? She had the gun to her head. Vanya was completely focused on the other siblings, and Alison could have shot her in the head and killed her. And I actually want to talk about that to book comparison, but she could have done that, but instead she basically just broke her concentration. Now, of course, because she did this, the power went out of Vanya and shot up to the moon and destroyed the moon and meteorites and the end of the world, pretty much. So what we saw from this was that maybe the end of the world was completely unavoidable, right? Like, this was going to happen regardless. Now, in a way, maybe if Alison would have shot Vanya straight up in the head point blank, maybe that would have stopped it, but who knows, maybe something would have ricocheted. I kind of felt like the end of the world was kind of unavoidable, that they were going to have to go to this point where what 5 ended up doing, which was transporting them somewhere. So now we're kind of left with this situation of, one, where did they go? Did they all end up staying together? Because, you know, we saw with 5, he came back, he thought he was going to be an older man, which I'm so glad he wasn't an older man. It totally works him being a kid. And the actor who plays him is awesome. Not a kid, excuse me, a preteen, probably. But it's going to be interesting with season 2. Fingers crossed we get a season 2. I feel like we will, although Netflix has been on a chopping block lately at the time of me making this video. I think it's going to be interesting to see where they end up. Are they all going to be intact? Are they going to have their memories? Because at the end, we saw them kind of revert back to kids. But that might have been more of a mental thing of them all being together finally, because we did have flashbacks between them being younger and being older. So I thought that was more than them like actually turning into little kids. I don't think that is what happened at all. I think this was more like a mental thing. And it's going to be interesting where that goes. And so they didn't succeed in not ending the world. So the question is, are they going to get another chance at it? Because this was such a character-driven show, it's kind of really like you kind of have to talk about what happened with each character within this bigger plot line and the things they went through to get to that point of the bigger plot line of them all coming together at the end. And yay, all of them coming together at the end. I think one of the great things this show did, as I said in my spoiler-free review, is that it made it so that, you know, sometimes when you see the synopsis of a show that, oh, they're so dysfunctional, none of them get along, you can really fall into the trope of all the characters just being super unlikable and you just not liking anybody. And I think this show did a very good job of adding heart and adding, you know, something to the characters where I think all of them were somewhat relatable on some kind of level. Maybe not all of them are your faves, but you definitely could see where each of them were coming from, especially in their trauma and the things they dealt with. I like that Alison, like I said, who was to me the MVP of this season. I mean, we did not get enough of her. I feel like I would have liked to see, I mean, I kind of understood why, because of what happened with her daughter Claire, that she was not trying to do I Heard a Rumor, which, can we just say that it's like an awesome power to have? Not that I'm saying I'd abuse it if I had it, but that's a pretty awesome power. I mean, Vanya we saw was like super powerful because she has such a force in her, but Alison's power is just so, like, the things you could do, you can pretty much bend reality, or more so bend things. Well, yeah, she can kind of bend reality or also bend people's perception to do things simply by saying it. Like, that's something. And we didn't see a lot of her powers because she was going on a new route in her life because of what happened with losing custody of her child. I thought that was good, and I like the fact that throughout this whole season they really played up the Alison and Vanya connection of sisterly love, because they were kind of estranged growing up, and Alison was like, I try to be a sister to you, even though I failed because I got caught up in my own life. And I think that made it so much more powerful and resonating and tragic when Vanya slits her throat, right? Like, I felt that. I was like, oh my gosh. So when Vanya realizes what she did, and then later on she hears the message that Alison sent her, you're like, man, that's gotta suck. I felt like Alison got the short end of the stick because, and I'll talk about this in comic book comparison, but in this, you know, version of her, she's quite likable. Yeah, she's probably done some shady stuff. I mean, it alludes to her having done shady stuff. But in this instance of leading up to the so-called apocalypse, she was trying to be a better human being. I'll admit, in the midst of this, I understood where Vanya was coming from, but I felt like it was too obvious to really see her as like the main protagonist, because they did it so overtly. I'm not going to say it was heavy-handed. I'm going to say they really drove home this idea that she was ostracized from her family, that she felt like, you know, the outsider, and they really played up this idea of her feeling like a victim. But what I also liked in the show is that there were moments where different characters, even sometimes the characters themselves, would bring up the idea of, I am responsible for my own condition right now. I am responsible for what happens to me and my choices. And there was this kind of theme of all of them at times kind of relying too much of playing the victim. And I felt like Vanya did that sometimes, and that's how Leonard, Harold, whoever he was able to kind of slip in there, because of her kind of wallowing in this kind of thing she's made of herself. Now, of course, with the help of Alison, without Alison really knowing she was doing it, of her feeling so ordinary. But even if you felt so ordinary, you know, it's kind of like she did wallow in this idea of not just feeling ordinary, but somewhat feeling pathetic, right? I just really like the dynamics of all the siblings in this situation. And I like the fact that they were able to kind of mix and match. Like, it wasn't this thing where like only these two siblings hung out pretty much the majority of the season, and these two siblings were the ones that were the majority of the season. They always mixed and matched when they went out on things. Like, sometimes Alison would hang out with Diego, and you got a vibe of how him and Alison got along or whatever. Then of course it would be Alison and Luther, or it would be, you know, Claus and Diego, or Claus and Luther, or Claus and Alison, and you had these mix and match kind of things. Now with Vanya, it was a little bit more where she was with Harold most of the time, but that was because it was part of the plot line where she needed to be isolated. But if it wasn't with him, it was with Alison that she got to kind of interact with, and at times Diego in a very antagonistic kind of way. So I think it did well where these characters kind of got to play off of each other, where you're like, okay, these characters can exist without just being tied to the hip to one other character, because they are full-fleshed characters, and it works. I'll admit, in the midst of it, my faves are Alison and Diego, mainly because I think it could be very obvious to dislike Diego, but I came to like him because you saw his motivations. Like, I don't want to say he was practical, but he wore his heart on his sleeve. Like, the reason why he was the way he was because he was so passionate about the things he felt, about the trauma he dealt with, about his family life, about where he was now, about, you know, his ex-lover who got killed. You know, he led a life with passion, and it showed, even if it was kind of, you know, brutal at times, and kind of, you know, dickish moves of the way he would talk to some of his siblings and things of that nature. But he was a straight shooter, right? He was someone who literally told you what he was thinking, whether you liked it or not. In the midst of all this, with the agency and stuff, we had Hazel and Cha-Cha in the mix of this. I thought that was a decent enough dynamic. They had kind of their own little plot going on. I mean, in a way, they came there being after 5, and it was a subplot, but it kind of ended up playing into the main plot, because in the end, they were like assigned to have to protect Vanya. I thought it worked. I'll talk about relationships in a second when it comes to Hazel and his situation, and Hazel and Cha-Cha and their situation. But it was fine. I mean, at times I felt like they were more comedic relief than actually being really necessary for the plot in a way. Maybe just kind of like, we need to break from the other characters, so let's go to Hazel and Cha-Cha. All right. But it would appear that Hazel went somewhere with Agnes with the time traveling box, and Cha-Cha's dead. I don't know why they did her like that. I don't think she should have died. I don't know. I'm hoping she's not dead. So overall, we don't know where they went. And that's kind of a very much a cliffhanger, an awesome cliffhanger, but also like, where does this leave them? Especially with Vanya, because they knocked her out, but she kind of went homicidal and she killed people, like people really dear to them. That's going to be hard to repair. And it's like, is she completely cured? Like, what's good? Also, Luther was really stubborn, and I feel like he should have totally listened to Alison. And I'll talk about this in Ship Talk, I totally understood where he was coming from, in the sense that, you know, he's in love with Alison, he thought he was gonna lose her, and he was just like, I can't have that happen again. But because he wasn't listening to her and trying to appeal to Vanya, I feel like he caused more problems. Luther and Alison. I don't care what any of you say. Some of you haven't ever watched Game of Thrones, and it shows. What I'm saying is, there's way weirder situations than Luther and Alison. Yes, they grew up in the same home, but it's a very weird dynamic, right? I know I'm not going to get into the whole thing of, is this incest, is it not? They grew up together, but I mean, through flashbacks, it was very much shown that Luther and her have always had a romantic leaning towards each other. So I don't really get where people are coming from. Like, first of all, they're not blood related. And their father, their adopted father, was hardly a father to them, right? He was more of a caretaker, more of a trainer. So, I mean, it can be understood why maybe some of the characters felt a sisterly bond, like Alison felt towards Vanya. But then in another sense, it felt like a boarding school, and why Alison had romantic feelings for Luther and vice versa. But I dig it. I ship them. And oh my gosh, that dance scene was epic and it was awesome. And it just drove home how much chemistry these characters have. And then that moment when she had him talk for her to Claire, and it was so intense. And like, while he was talking to Claire, he was basically letting her know what he felt for her. And yes, they do very much. I mean, I feel like they've never acted like siblings. I think their whole dynamic has always been two people who have had relationships and still had harboring feelings for each other, or more so Alison having a relationship with her ex-husband, but having these feelings for Luther, and Luther being in love with her and never saying it, you know? So, I mean, that's always been a thing for them. So I really like this. I think they really built this love story between them, and I want to see where it goes. I think it's awesome. I like it. I don't care what y'all say if y'all don't like it. I like it, and clearly I'm hoping, this is my mini rant, I hope that the writers stand in their weird truth of continuing this and going through with it, despite what some people online who want to act fake outrage about it may say. Vanya and Harold, or is it Leonard? Yeah, well, you know, Leonard's dead, and he deserved it. Totally. I mean, he was a tragic character. I mean, he dealt with stuff himself, but I don't think that justifies, you know, manipulating someone who was just looking for someone to care for them. I don't think that the ends justifies the means at all. So, yeah, it was a manipulative relationship, and it came to an end, and I think it was rightfully done where Vanya was the one to kill him. Claus and Dave. So Claus went back to Vietnam, and basically when he came back, you know, Dave, his former love, or his love in another timeline or whatever, died. And so, you know, he had been trying to reach him for most of the rest of the season by getting clean. Like, that was his push to get clean, was because he wanted to reach out to Dave, which was a great motivation. But it doesn't seem like he ever got to talk to him, which sucks. So hopefully maybe somewhere along the line they reunite, maybe, because it seemed like Claus really had this epic situation with him, and I think he deserves some love. Hazel and Agnes, that was weird. It was alright. I mean, he seemed like he liked her from jump, just because I guess she seemed sweet. I don't know. It was alright. I mean, I guess he needed that plot point to, like, have his motivation to want to leave the agency, so yay. Five and Dolores. Yeah, that was sad. I'm not even going to say that was his Wilson, like that Tom Hanks movie. I'm going to say he actually genuinely cared. And this is what gets me. Like, people are like I've seen some people online up in arms about Luther and Alison. And Fives pretty much had like a full-fledged relationship with a mannequin. And not even a full mannequin at that. Like a half of a mannequin, where he was really like into this mannequin. Come on. So, yeah, he had to break up with her. And he returned her to the store. Cha-Cha and Hazel. You know, I think Cha-Cha had some feelings for Hazel, pretty much. I think somewhere along the line she got attached to him in a domestic kind of way, and when she saw that he was ready to go away with Agnes, maybe she didn't overtly say it, but she had some sort of feeling about kind of being pushed aside in her mind for Agnes. Maybe not romantically wanting him, but kind of having this partnership that she didn't want to let go. And I hope Cha-Cha isn't dead, because I think that could go somewhere, but I also know it could be repetitive if she's like trying to go after him. But it seemed like she burned up at the end of the world and he got away, which is also kind of like, why did he get to go away? He did crappy stuff too. What, just because he felt bad afterwards? Okay, so my prediction is that we are going to have it so that they ended up getting off of the planet before it like ended, but I think they get separated. I think it's not going to be easy for them to end up somewhere else. Maybe they'll all end up in the same timeline, but I feel like that would be too easy, and I think season 2 might have it so that they're all in separate spaces trying to find their way back to each other. Okay, so just in terms of the book comparison, I don't want to have a long list of things because I really do think this show stands on its own, and there are actually a lot of tweaks and differences, although I feel like they kept with the major plot lines, like the Luther and Alison love story, because it is a love story, guys. They kept with that, and I'm glad they did. In fact, I feel like they made it less toxic, actually. I think from what I understand in the book, Alison and Luther, pretty much all the kids, I mean, this is kind of a comparison, pretty much all the kids were unlikable from my understanding, and like they were all very narcissistic, very one-track minded, not very likable people, probably a more hard-edged version of what would happen to them depending on how they were raised. And I think the TV show went a route of making them a little less unlikable in various degrees, and I think because of that, it actually boded well or better for the Luther and Alison love story. So they kept with that, although the difference is that I feel like they made a lot of the characters a lot more likable. The other thing they didn't do was there's another kind of semi-sibling thing where Vanya and Diego have a thing, or more so Diego is in love with Vanya, and they didn't do that. And I'm kind of glad they didn't, because I think one, is it or isn't it a thing, battle is enough. You know, I mean, I love Luther and Alison, but I don't think we need to have it so that they all were falling for each other, which is maybe a little bit more not predictable, but maybe, you know, these kids grow up in a boarding house and maybe, you know, things happen, right? So I don't know. I'm just, you know, that was a thing in the book. They didn't do the secondary plot. They're doing the one with Luther and Alison. And I guess my only other pointed out thing was that, from my understanding from the graphic novels, is that their adoptive father was actually an alien. And I feel like in episode 10, we got glimpses of him being somewhat different than a regular human, but we don't know how. In the graphic novels, it's revealed that he was an alien, Martian or something like that, in disguise as a billionaire, but in this, they didn't do it. They may be saving it for later. I feel like a lot of the plot lines they didn't get to, but they are going to get to, so we may see that in the future. Okay, so that was a lot. I tried to pretty much cover like some of the highlights that really stood out to me and what I was feeling about those, but it's a lot to get into. I'm really actually excited for where they're going to take season 2 and these characters, these awesome characters, and I want to know what you think. Let me know. Comment down below. Who is your fave? Who's your fave? Let me know. And tell me about your love for Luther and Alison, because it can only be love. Yes, let me know. Comment down below. Let me know your thoughts. And also, be sure to subscribe so that you are the first to know when I post my videos of all things horror, dark fantasy, and dark superhero. Thanks for watching. Let's get creepy together.